Story 16 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Dead Woman's Photograph. Virgil Hoyt is a photographer's assistant up at St. Paul, and a man of a good deal of taste. He has been in search of the picturesque all over the West, and hundreds of miles to the north in Canada, and can speak 3 or 4 Indian dialects, and put a canoe through the rapids. That is to say, he is a man of an adventurous sort and no dreamer. He can fight well and shoot well and swim well enough to put up a winning race with the Indian boys, and he can sit all day in the saddle and not dream about it at night. Wherever he goes he uses his camera. The world, Hoyt is in the habit of saying to those who sit with him when he smokes his pipe, was created in 6 days to be photographed. Man, and especially woman, was made for the same purpose. Clouds are not made to give moisture, nor trees to cast shade. They were created for the photographer. In short, Virgil Hoyt's view of the world is whimsical, and he doesn't like to be bothered with anything disagreeable. That is the reason he loathes and detests going to a house of mourning to photograph a corpse. The horribly bad taste of it offends him partly, and partly he is annoyed at having to shoulder, even for a few moments, a part of someone's burden of sorrow. He doesn't like sorrow, and would willingly canoe 500 miles up the cold Canadian rivers to get rid of it. Nevertheless, as assistant photographer, it is often his duty to do this very kind of thing. Not long ago he was sent for by a rich Jewish family at St. Paul to photograph the mother, who had just died. He was very much put out, but he went. He was taken to the front parlor where the dead woman lay in her coffin. It was evident that there was some excitement in the household and that a discussion was going on, but Hoyt wasn't concerned, and so he paid no attention to the matter. The daughter wanted the coffin turned on end, in order that the corpse might face the camera properly, but Hoyt said he could overcome the recumbent attitude and make it appear that the face was taken in the position it would naturally hold in life, and so they went out and left him alone with the dead. The face was a strong and positive one, such as may often be seen among Jewish matrons. Hoyt regarded it with some admiration, thinking to himself that she was a woman who had been used to having her own way. There was a strand of hair out of place. He pushed it back from her brow. A bud lifted its head too high from among the roses on her breast and spoiled the contour of the chin, so he broke it off. He remembered these things later very distinctly, and that his hand touched her bare face 2 or 3 times. Then he took the photographs and left the house. He was very busy at the time, and several days elapsed before he was able to develop the plates. He took them from the bath, in which they had lain with a number of others, and went to work upon them. There were 3 plates. He hadn't taken that number merely as a precaution against any accident. They came up well, but as they developed he became aware of the existence of something in the photograph which had not been apparent to his eye. The mysterious always came under the head of the disagreeable with him, and was therefore to be banished, so he made only a few prints and put the things away out of sight. He hoped that something would intervene to save him from attempting an explanation. But it is a part of the general perplexity of life that things do not intervene as they ought when they ought. So one day his employer asked him what had become of those photographs. He tried to evade him, but it was futile, and he got out the finished photographs and showed them to him. The older man sat staring at them a long time. "Hoyt," said he at length, "you're a young man, and I suppose you have never seen anything like this before. But I have. Not exactly the same thing, but similar phenomena have come my way a number of times since I went into the business, and I want to tell you there are things in heaven and earth not dreamt of." "Oh, I know all that tommy rot," cried Hoyt angrily, "but when anything happens, I want to know the reason why, and how it is done." "All right," said his employer, "then you might explain why and how the sun rises." But he humored the younger man sufficiently to examine with him the bath in which the plates were submerged, and the plates themselves. All was as it should be, but the mystery was there and could not be done away with. Hoyt hoped against hope that the friends of the dead woman would somehow forget about the photographs, but of course the wish was unreasonable, and one day the daughter appeared and asked to see the photographs of her mother. "Well, to tell the truth," stammered Hoyt, "those didn't come out as well as we could wish." "But let me see them," persisted the lady. "I'd like to look at them anyway." "Well now," said Hoyt, trying to be soothing, as he believed it was always best to be with women. To tell the truth, he was an ignoramus where women were concerned. "I think it would be better if you didn't see them. There are reasons why." He ambled on like this, stupid man that he was. And of course the Jewess said she would see those pictures without any further delay. So poor Hoyt brought them out and placed them in her hand, and then ran for the water pitcher, and had to be at the bother of bathing her forehead to keep her from fainting. For what the lady saw was this. Over the face and flowers and the head of the coffin fell a thick veil, the edges of which touched the floor in some places. It covered the features so well that not a hint of them was visible. "There was nothing over mother's face," cried the lady at length. "Not a thing," acquiesced Hoyt. "I know because I had occasion to touch her face just before I took the picture. I put some of her hair back from her brow." "What does it mean then?" asked the lady. "You know better than I. There's no explanation in science. Perhaps there's some in psychology." "Well," said the lady, stammering a little and coloring, "mother was a good woman, but she always wanted her own way, and she always had it, too." "Yes?" "And she never would have her picture taken. She didn't admire herself. She said no one should ever see a picture of hers." "So?" said Hoyt meditatively. "Well, she's kept her word, hasn't she?" The two stood looking at the pictures for a time. Then Hoyt pointed to the open blaze in the grate. "Throw them in," he commanded. "Don't let your father see them. Don't keep them yourself. They wouldn't be good things to keep." "That's true enough," said the lady slowly. And she threw them in the fire. Then Virgil Hoyt brought out the plates and broke them before her eyes. And that was the end of it, except that Hoyt sometimes tells the story to those who sit beside him when his pipe is lighted. End of story 16. Story 17 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ghost of a Live Man. We were in the South Atlantic Ocean, in the latitude of the island of Fernando Noronha, about 40 degrees 12 minutes south, on board the bark H.G. Johnson, homeward bound from Australia. I was the only passenger, and we had safely rounded Cape Horn, with the barometer at 28 degrees 18 minutes, and yet had somehow miraculously escaped any extremely heavy gale, had light northerly and easterly winds till we reached 20 degrees, and thence the southeast trades were sending us fast on our way to the equator. I sat on deck smoking my pipe, with a glorious full moon shedding its bright pathway across the blue waters, and chatting with the first mate, a man of some 58 years of age, who had followed the sea since he was a boy. For 20 years or more he had been a mate or captain, and many and varied were the experiences he could relate. A thorough sailor and a skillful navigator, he was as honest as the day is long, had a heart as big as an ox, and was an all-around good fellow and genial companion. Some of his yarns might be taken cum grano salis, yet he always positively assured me that he was telling me the truth. An account of a voyage that he made in a whaler from the Southern Ocean to New Bedford seemed to me worthy to be repeated. He had rounded Cape Horn 6 times and the Cape of Good Hope 26 times, besides making many trips across the Western Ocean and to South American ports. I give his account as near as possible in his own words. It was in '71 that I commanded the whaler Mary Jane. We had been out from home for over 3 years, and had on board a full cargo of whale oil, besides 2,000 pounds of whalebone, which was then worth $5 per pound. I had also been fortunate enough to find in a dead whale which we came across a large quantity of ambergris, and our hearts were all very light as we began our homeward voyage, and our thoughts all tended to the hearty welcome which we should receive from wives and sweethearts when we reached our journey's end. Many a night I lay in my berth, I had thought with great pleasure of the amount of money that would be coming to me from the proceeds of our voyage when we arrived in New Bedford. I calculated that I had made $12,000 as my share of the proceeds of the whalebone and oil, to say nothing of the ambergris, which I well knew would bring at least $20,000, and one half of which belonged to me. You can therefore imagine that I was well pleased with myself as we went bounding along through the southeast trades. We crossed the equator in longitude 36, and soon after took strong northeast trades, and all was going well as I could wish. We had put the ship in perfect order, painted her inside and out, and you would never have recognized her as the old whaling ship that had for 3 years been plying the Southern Ocean for whales. Never shall I forget the old bull whale that we tackled about 2 degrees to the south of Cape Horn, but that is another story, which I will give you another time. We had just lost the northeast trades and were entering the Gulf Stream. I sat in my cabin with my chart on the table before me rolled up. I had just picked our location on it, and was thinking that in a week or more I should be at home, surrounded by those near and dear to me, and relating to them the story of my great good fortune. It was always my custom to work up my latitude and longitude about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then after supper pick off her position on the chart, have a smoke, and perhaps just before retiring a nip of grog. And then at 8:30 o'clock, as regular as a clock, I would turn in. I am a great smoker, and this day I had been smoking all the afternoon, besides having had 2 or 3 nips. We had a dog on board whom we called Bosun, who had been out with us all the voyage, and who was afraid of nothing. He had endeared himself to every man on board, and when Bosun took water, something very serious was in the wind. This night, as I sat in the cabin, I heard a most dismal howl from Bosun, and called out to the mate to know what was the matter with the dog. He replied that he reckoned some of the men had been teasing him, and the occurrence soon passed from my mind. Suddenly I saw someone coming down the after companionway into the cabin. I supposed at first it was the mate, and wondered that he had not first spoken to me. But then I noticed that he wore clothes I had never seen on the mate, and as he advanced into the cabin I saw his face. It was the face of a man I had never seen in my life. He was thin and pale and haggard, and as he advanced he looked about the cabin and at the rolled-up chart on the table. There seemed to be an appeal in his eyes, and then there swept over his face a look of intense disappointment, and before I could move or speak, he had vanished from my sight. Now I am a very practical man, and I at once straightened myself in my chair and said to myself, "Well, old man, you smoked one too many pipes today, or else you've had one drink too much, for you have been asleep in your chair and seen a ghost." I was quite satisfied that I had had a dream, especially as I called to the mate and asked him if he had seen anyone come below. He said no, that he had not left the deck for the last hour, and the man at the wheel, directly in front of the door, was sure no one had entered the cabin. So I convinced myself that I had had a very vivid dream, though I could not help thinking of the matter all through the next day. At 8 o'clock the next evening, I sat in the same place with my work just finished, and the chart rolled up on the table before me, when suddenly the dog's dismal howl rang through the ship, and looking up I saw those same legs coming down the after companion. My hair fairly stood on end, and yet today surely I was wide awake. I had only smoked 1 pipe all day, and had not touched a drop of liquor. The same wan, emaciated figure walked into the cabin, glanced inquiringly and appealing at me, and again there spread over his face that look of utter disappointment, as if he had sought something and failed to find it, and again he disappeared. I rushed on deck to the mate and told him all I had seen the last 2 nights, but he made light of it, and assured me I had been asleep or smoking too much. He did not like to suggest that I had been drinking. Still, I could see that the thought that came into his mind was, the old man has seen him again. I gave up trying to convince him, but requested that the next night, from 8 to 8:30, he should sit with me in the cabin. How the next day passed I cannot tell. I only know that my thoughts never left that ghostly visitant, and somehow I felt that the evening would reveal something to me and the spell be broken. I made up my mind I would speak to the thing, whatever it was, and I felt a sort of security in the presence of the mate, who was a daring fellow and feared neither man nor the devil. Neither rum nor tobacco passed my lips during the next day, and 8 o'clock found the mate and I sitting in the cabin, and this time the chart lay open on the table beside us. Just as 8 bells struck, the dog's premonitory wail sounded, and looking up we both saw the figure descending the cabin stairs. We both seemed frozen to our seats, and the strange weirdness of the whole proceeding cast the same spell over the mate and me alike, and we were both unable to move or speak. Slowly the figure proceeded into the cabin and glanced around without a word, but with the same expectant look on his face. His form was even more wasted, his cheeks sunken, and his eyes seemed almost out of sight, so deeply were they set in their sockets. As his eye fell on the open chart, a look of supreme joy fairly irradiated his features, and advancing to the table he placed one long, bony finger on the chart, held it for a moment, and then again disappeared from our sight. For 5 minutes after he had left us we sat speechless. Then I managed to say, "What do you think of that, Mr. Morris?" "My God, sir, I don't know. It's beyond me." Then my eyes fell on the open chart, and there where the finger had been was a tiny spot of blood, exactly on the point of longitude 63 degrees west and latitude 37 degrees north. We were then only about 50 miles distant from that position, and immediately there came to me the determination to steer the ship there, so I laid her course accordingly, and posted a lookout in the crow's nest. At 5 o'clock in the morning, just as the east began to grow gray, the lookout called out, "Boat on the lee bow," and as we came up to it we found 4 men in it, 3 dead and 1 with just a remnant of life left in him. We sewed the 3 bodies in canvas and buried them in the ocean, and then gave all our attention to restoring life to the poor emaciated frame, which, I then recognized, was the very man who for 3 successive nights had visited me in my cabin. By judicious and careful nursing, life gradually came back to him, and in 4 days' time he was able to sit up and talk with me in the cabin. It seems he commanded the ship Promise, and she had taken fire and been destroyed, and all hands had to take to the boats. 10 were in the boats at first, but their food had given out, and one by one he had seen them die, and one by one he had cast the bodies overboard. Finally he lost consciousness and knew not whether his 3 remaining companions were dead or alive. Then he said he seemed in a dream to see a ship and tried to go to her for help, but just as he would be going on board of her, something would seem to keep him back. 3 times in his dreams he tried to visit this ship, and the last time there seemed to come to him a certain satisfaction, and he felt that he had succeeded in his object. Turning to my table he said, "Let me take your chart, I'll show you just where we were." "Stop," said I, "don't take that chart. It is an old one and all marked over. Mark your position on this new one." He took my pencil and knife, and carefully sharpened his pencil. Then, taking my dividers, he measured his latitude and longitude, and placed a pencil dot at a point on the clean chart. As he lifted his hand he said, "Oh, excuse me, Captain, I cut my finger in sharpening the pencil and left a drop of blood on the chart. "Never mind," said I, "leave it there." And then I produced the old chart, and there, in an exactly corresponding place, was the drop of blood left by my ghostly visitor. Then, looking steadily into my face, the mate solemnly added, "I can't explain this, sir. Perhaps you can. But I can tell you on my honor it's God's own truth that I have told you." End of story 17. Story 18 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ghost of Washington. It was early on Christmas morning when John Riley wheeled away from a picturesque little village where he had passed the previous night, to continue his cycling tour through eastern Pennsylvania. Today his intention was to stop at Valley Forge, and then to ride up the Schuylkill Valley, visiting in turn the many points of historical interest that lay along his route. Valley Forge, his road map indicated, was but a short distance further on. All round him were the hills and fields and roads over which Washington and his half-starved army had forged and roamed throughout the trying winter of 1777-78, 126 years ago. It was a beautiful Christmas day, truly, and as he wheeled along, young Riley's thoughts were almost equally divided between the surrounding pleasant scenery and the folks at home, who, he knew very well, were assembling at just about the present time round a heavily laden Christmas tree in the front parlor. The sun rose higher and higher, and Riley pedaled on down the valley, passing every now and then quaint, pleasant-looking farmhouses, many of which, no doubt, had been built anterior to the period which had given the vicinity its history. Arriving finally at a place where the road forked off in two directions, Riley was puzzled which way to go on. There happened to be a dwelling close by. Accordingly he dismounted, left his wheel leaning against a gate-post at the side of the road, and walked up a wretchedly flagged walk leading to the house, with the idea of getting instructions from its inmates. Situated in the center of an unkept field of rank grass and weeds, the building lay back from the highway probably 150 feet. It was long and low in shape, containing but one story, and having what is termed a gabled roof, under which there must have been an attic of no mean size. On coming close to the house, a fact Riley had not noticed from the road became plainly evident. It was deserted. He saw that the roof and side shingles were in wretched condition, that the window sashes and frames as well as the doors and door frames were missing from the openings in the side walls where once they had been, and that the entire side of the house, including that part of the stone foundation which showed above the ground, was full of cracks and seams. At first, on the point of turning back, he concluded to see what the interior was like anyway. Accordingly he went inside. Glancing around the large dust-filled room he had entered, his gaze at first failed to locate any object of the least interest. A rickety-appearing set of steps went up into the attic from one side of the apartment, and over in one corner was a large open fireplace, from the walls of which much of the brickwork had become loosened and fallen out. Riley had started up the steps toward the attic, when happening to look back for an instant, his attention was attracted to a singular-looking, jug-shaped bottle no larger than a vinegar cruet, which lay upon its side on the hearth of the fireplace, partly covered up by debris of loose bricks and mortar. He hastened back down the steps and crossed the room, taking the bottle up in his hand and examining it with curiosity. Being partly filled with a liquid of some kind or other, the bottle was very soon uncorked and held under the young man's nose. The liquid gave forth a peculiar, pungent, and inviting odor. Without further hesitation, Riley's lips sought the neck of the bottle. It is hardly possible to describe the pleasure and satisfaction his senses experienced as he drank. While the liquid was still gurgling down his throat, a heavy hand was placed most suddenly on his shoulder, and his body was given a violent shaking. The bottle fell to the floor and was broken into 100 pieces. "Hello," said a rough voice almost in Riley's ear. "Who are you anyway, and what are you doing within the lines?" "A spy, I'll be bound." As most assuredly there had been no one else in the vicinity of the building when he had entered it, and with equal certainty no one had come down the steps from the attic, Riley was naturally surprised and mystified by this unexpected assault. He struggled instinctively to break loose from the unfriendly grasp, and when he finally succeeded, he twisted his body around so that he faced across the room. Immediately he made the remarkable discovery that there were 4 other persons in the apartment, 3 uncouth-looking fellows habited in fantastic but ragged garments, and a matronly-looking woman, the latter standing over a wash-tub which had been elevated upon 2 chairs in a corner near the fireplace. To all appearance, the woman had been busy at her work, and had stopped for the moment to see what the men were going to do. Her waist sleeves were rolled up to the shoulders, and her arms dripped with water and soap suds. Over the tops of the tubs, partly filled with water, there were visible the edges of several well-soaked fabrics. To add to his astonishment, he noticed that in the chimney place, which a moment before was falling apart, but now seemed to be clean and in good condition, a cheerful fire burned, and that above the flames was suspended an iron pot, from which issued a jet of steam. He also noticed that the entire appearance of the room had undergone a great change. Everything seemed to be in good repair, tidy and neat. The ceilings, the walls and the door, even the stairway leading to the attic. The openings in the walls were fitted with window sashes and well-painted doors. The apartment had, in fact, evolved under his very eyesight from a state of absolute ruin into one of excellent preservation. All of this seemed so weird and uncanny that Riley stood for a moment or two in the transformed apartment, utterly dumbfounded, with his mouth wide open and his eyes all but popping out of his head. He was brought to his senses by the fellow who had shaken him growlingly out. "Come, explain yourself." "An explanation is due me," Riley managed to gasp. "Don't bandy words with the rascal, Harry," one of the other men spoke up. "Bring him along to headquarters." Thereupon, without further parley, the 3 men marched Riley in military fashion into the open air and down to the road. Here he picked up at the gate-post his bicycle, while they unstacked a group of 3 old-fashioned-looking muskets located close by. When the young man had entered the house a few minutes before, this stack of arms had not been there. He could not understand it. Neither could he understand, on looking back at the building as he was marched off down the road, the mysterious agency that had transformed its dilapidated exterior, just as it had been the interior, into a practically new condition. While they trudged along, the strangers exhibited a singular interest in the wheel Riley pushed at his side, running their coarse hands over the frame and handlebar, and acting on the whole as though they never before had seen a bicycle. This in itself was another surprise. He had hardly supposed there were 3 men in the country so totally unacquainted with what is a most familiar piece of mechanism everywhere. At the same time that they were paying so much attention to the wheel, Riley in turn was studying with great curiosity his singular-looking captors. Rough, unprepossessing appearing fellows they were, large of frame and unshaven, and it must be added, dirty of face. What remained of their very ragged clothing, he had already noticed, was of a most remarkable cut and design, resembling closely the garments worn by the Continental militiamen in the War of Independence. The hats were broad, low of crown, and 3-cornered in shape. The trousers were buff-colored and extended at the knees, and the long, blue spike-tailed coats were flapped over at the extremities of the tails, the flaps being fastened down with good-sized brass buttons. Leather leggings were strapped around cowhide boots, through the badly worn feet of which, in places where the leather had cracked open, the flesh unprotected by stockings could be seen. Dressed as he was, in a cleanly, gray cycling costume, Riley's appearance, most assuredly, was strongly in contrast to that of his companions. After a brisk walk of 20 minutes, during which they occasionally met and passed by one or two or perhaps a group of men clothed and outfitted like Riley's escorts, the little party followed the road up a slight incline and around a well-wooded bend to the left, coming quite suddenly, and to the very captive, very unexpectedly, to what was without a doubt a military encampment. A village, in fact, composed of many rows of small log huts. Along the streets, between the buildings, muskets were stacked in hundreds of places. Over in one corner, on a slight eminence commanding the road up which they had come, and cleverly hidden from it behind trees and shrubbery, the young man noticed a battery of field pieces. Wherever the eye was turned on this singular scene were countless numbers of soldiers all garmented in three-cornered hats, spike-tailed coats, and knee breeches, walking lazily hither and thither, grouped around crackling fires, or parading up and down the streets in platoons under the guidance of ragged but stern-looking officers. Harry stopped the little procession of four in front of one of the larger of the log houses. Then, while they stood there, the long blast from a bugle was heard, followed by the roll of drums. A minute or two afterward, several companies of militia marched up and grounded their arms, forming three sides of a hollow square around them, the fourth and open side being toward the log house. Directly succeeding this maneuver there came through the doorway of the house and stepped up the center of the square, stopping directly in front of Riley, a dignified-looking person, tall and straight and splendidly proportioned of figure, and having a face of great nobility and character. The cold chills chased one another down Riley's back. His limbs swayed and tottered beneath his weight. He had never experienced another such sensation of mingled astonishment and fright. He was in the presence of General Washington. Not a phantom Washington either, but Washington in the flesh and blood, as material and earthly as a being as ever crossed a person's line of vision. Riley, in his time, had seen so many portraits, marble busts and statues of the great commander, that he could not be mistaken. Recovering the use of his faculties, which for the moment he seemed to have lost, Riley did the very commonplace thing that others before him have done when placed unexpectedly in remarkable situations. He pinched himself to make sure that he was in reality wide awake and in the natural possession of his senses. He felt like pinching the figure in front of him also, but he could not muster up the courage to do that. He stood there trying to think it all out, and as his thoughts became less stagnant, his fright dissolved under the process of reasoning his mind pursued. To reason a thing out, even though an explanation can only be obtained by leaving much of the subject unaccounted for, tends to make one bolder and less shaky in the knees. The series of strange incidents which he was experiencing had been inaugurated in the old-fashioned dwelling he had visited after information concerning the roads, and everything had been going along in a perfectly normal way up to the very moment when he had taken a drink from the bottle found in the fireplace. But from that precise time everything had gone wrongly. Hence the inference that the drinking of the peculiar liquid was accountable in some way or other for his troubles. There was a supernatural agency in the whole thing. That much must be admitted. And whatever that agency was, and however it might be accounted for, it had taken Riley back into a period of time more than 100 years ago, and landed him, body and soul, within the lines of the patriotic forces wintering at Valley Forge. He might have stood there, turning over and over in his mind, pinching himself and muttering, all the morning, had not the newcomer ceased a silent but curious inspection of his person, and asked, "Who are you, sir?" "John Riley, at your pleasure," the young man replied, adding a question on his own account, "And who are you, sir?" Immediately he received a heavy thump on his back from Harry's hard fist. "It is not for you to question the general," the ragged administrator of the blow exclaimed. "And it is not for you to be so gay," Riley returned angrily, giving the blow back with added force. "Here, here," broke in the first questioner. "Fisticuffs under my very nose. No more of this. I command you both." To Harry he added an extra caution. "Your zeal in my behalf will be better appreciated by being less demonstrative. Blows should be struck only on the battlefield." To Riley he said, with a slight smile hovering over his face, "My name is Washington. Perhaps you may have heard of me." To this Riley replied, "I have indeed, and heard you very well spoken of, too." Emboldened by the other's smile, he ventured another question. "I think my reckoning of the day and year is badly at fault. An hour ago I thought the day was Christmas Day. How far out of the way did my calculation take me, sir?" "The day is indeed Christmas Day, and the year is, as you must know, the year of our Lord 1777. Riley again pinched himself. "Why do you bring this man to me?" Washington now inquired, turning to Harry and his companions. "He is a spy, sir," said Harry. "That is a lie," Riley indignantly interpolated. "I have done nothing to warrant any such charge. We found him in the widow Robin's house, pouring strong liquor down his throat. I had gone inside after information concerning the roads." "Which he was getting from a bottle, sir." "If drinking from a bottle of necessity constitutes being a spy, I fear our camp is already a hotbed." Washington somewhat sagely remarked, casting his eye around slyly at his officers and men. "Tell me," he went on, with sudden sternness, looking Riley through and through, as though to read his very thoughts, "is the charge true? Do you come from Howe?" "The charge is not true, sir. I come from no one. I'm simply making a tour of pleasure through this part of the country on my bicycle." With the country swarming with the men from two hostile armies, any kind of tour, save one of absolute necessity, seems ill-timed. "When I set out I knew nothing about any armies. The fact is, sir," Riley started to make an explanation, but he checked himself on realizing that the telling of any such improbable yarn would only increase the hazardousness of his position. "Well?" Washington questioned in a tone of growing suspicion. "I certainly did not know that your army or any other army was quartered in this vicinity." Riley hesitated for lack of something further to say. "You see," he finally added, prompted by a happy idea, "I rode my wheel from New York." "You may have come from New York, though it is hard to believe you came on that singular-looking machine so great a distance. Where is the horse which drew the vehicle?" Riley touched his bicycle. "This is the horse, sir, just as it is. The vehicle," he said. "The man is crazy," Harry exclaimed. Washington only looked the incredulity he felt, and this time asked a double question. "How can the thing be balanced without it being held upright by a pair of shafts from a horse's back, and how is the motive power acquired?" For an answer Riley jumped upon the wheel, and at a considerable speed and in a haphazard way pedalled around the place within the hollow square of soldiers. Hither and thither he went, at one second nearly wheeling over the toes of the line of astonished, if not frightened, militiamen, at the next bearing suddenly down on Harry and his companions, and making them dance and jump almost alertly to avoid a collision. Even the dignified Washington was once or twice put to the necessity of dodging hurriedly aside when his equilibrium was threatened. Riley eventually dismounted, doing so with assumed clumsiness by stopping the wheel at Harry's back and falling over heavily against the soldier. Harry tumbled to the ground, but Riley dexterously landed on his feet. At once he began offering a profusion of apologies. "You did that by design," Harry shouted, jumping to his feet. His face was red with anger, and he shook his fist threateningly at the bicyclist. Washington commanded the man to hold his peace. Then to Riley he expressed a great surprise at his performance, and a desire to know more about the bicycle. The young man thereupon described the machine minutely, lifting it into the air and spinning the wheels to illustrate how smoothly they rotated. "I can see it is possible to ride the contrivance with rapidity. It has been put together with wonderful ingenuity," Washington said, when Riley had replaced the wheel on the ground. "And you, sir, it is but a toy," an officer spoke up. "Put our friend on this bundle of tin and race him against one of our horsemen, and he would make a sorry showing." Riley smiled. "I bear the gentleman no ill will for his opinion," he said. "Still, I would like to show him by a practical test of the subject that his ignorance of it is most profound." "You would test the speed of the machine against that of a horse?" Washington said in amazement. "I would, sir. You have a good road yonder. With your permission and a worthy opponent, I would make the test at once." "But, sir, the man is a spy," Harry broke in. "Would it not be better to throw a rope around his neck and give him his deserts?" "The charge is by no means proven," Washington replied, "nor can it be until a court-martial convenes this afternoon. And I see no reason why we may not in the meantime enjoy the unique contest which has been suggested. It will make a pleasant break in the routine of camp life." A murmur of approval went up from the masses of men by whom they were surrounded. While they had been talking, it seemed as though everybody in the camp not already on the scene had gathered together behind the square of infantry. "Then, sir," Harry said, with some eagerness, "I would like to be the man to ride the horse. There is no better animal than mine anywhere, and I understand his tricks and humours quite well enough to put him to his best pace." "I confess I have heard you well spoken of as a horseman," Washington said. "Be away with you. Saddle and bridle your horse at once." It was the chain of singular circumstances narrated above which brought John Riley into the most remarkable contest of his life. He had entered many bicycle races at one time or another, always with credit to himself and to the club whose colours he wore, and he had every expectation of making a good showing today. Yet a reflection of the weird conditions which had brought about the present contest took away some of his self-possession when a few minutes later he was marched over to the turnpike and left to his own thoughts, while the officers were pacing out a 1-mile straightaway course down the road. After the measurement had been taken, 2 unbroken lines of soldiers were formed along the entire mile, a most evident precaution against Riley leaving the racecourse at any point to escape across the fields. Washington came up to him again, when the preparations were completed, to shake his hand and whisper a word or two of encouragement in his ear. Having performed these kindly acts, he left to take up a position near the point of finish. The beginning of the course was located close to the battery of half-concealed field pieces. Riley was now conducted to this place. Shortly afterward Harry appeared on his horse. He leered at the bicyclist contemptuously and said something of a sarcastic nature, partly under his breath when the two lined up, side by side, for the start. To these slights Riley paid no heed. He had a strong belief that when the race was over, there would be left in the mutton-like head of his opponent very little of his present inclination toward the humorous. The soldier's mount was a handsome black mare, 14½ hands high, strong of limbs and at the flanks, and animated by a spirit that kept her prancing around with continuous action. It must be admitted that the man rode very well. He guided the animal with ease and nonchalance when she reared and plunged, and kept her movements confined to an incredibly small piece of ground, considering her abundance of action. "Keep to your own side of the road throughout the race. I don't want to be collided with by your big beast," Riley cautioned while they were awaiting 2 signals from the starter. To this Harry replied in some derision, "I'll give you a good share of the road at the start, and all of it by my dust, too, afterward." And then the officer who held the pistol fired the first shot. Riley was well satisfied with the conditions under which the race was to be made. The road was wide and level, smooth, hard and straight, and a strong breeze which had sprung up blew squarely against his back. His wheel was geared up to 84 inches, The breeze promised to be a valuable adjunct in pushing it along. Awaiting the second and last signal, Riley glanced down the two blue ranks of soldiers, which stretched away into lazy lines in the distance and converged at the termination of the course, where a flag had been stuck into the ground. The soldiers were at parade rest. Their unceasing movements as they chatted to one another, turning their bodies this way and that and craning their heads forward to look toward the starting point, and then jerking them back, made the lines seem like long, squirming snakes. At the end of the course a thick bunch of military men clogged the road and overspread into the fields. Crack! The signal to be off. Riley shoved aside the fellow who had been holding his wheel upright while astride of it, and pushed down on the pedals. The mare's hoofs dug the earth. Her great muscular legs straightened out. She sprang forward with a snort of apparent pleasure, taking the lead at the very start. Riley heard the shout of excitement run along the two ranks of soldiers. He saw them waving their arms and hats as he went by. And on ahead through the cloud of dust there was visible the shadow-like outlines of the snorting, galloping horse, whose hoof-beats sounded clear and sharp above the din which came from the sides of the highway. The mare crept farther and farther ahead. Very soon 100 feet or more of the road lay between her and the bicyclist. Harry turned in his saddle and called out another sarcasm. "I shall pass you very soon. Keep to your side of the road," Riley shouted, not a bit daunted by the way the race had commenced. His head was well down over the handlebars. His back had the shape of the upper portion of an immense egg. Up and down his legs moved, faster and faster and faster yet. He went by the soldiers so rapidly that they only appeared by two streaks of blurry color. Their sharp rasping shouts sounded like cracking of musketry. The cloud of dust blew against the cyclist's head and into his mouth and throat. When he glanced ahead again, he saw with satisfaction that the mare was no longer increasing her lead. It soon became evident even that he was slowly cutting down the advantages she had secured. Harry again turned his head shortly afterward, doubtless expecting to find his opponent hopelessly distanced by this time. Instead of this, Riley was alarmingly close upon him. The man ejaculated a sudden oath and lashed his animal furiously. Straining every nerve and sinew, the mare for the moment pushed further ahead. Then her pace slackened a bit, and Riley again crept up to her. Closer and closer to her than before, until his head was abreast of her outstretched tail. Harry was lashing the mare and swearing at her unceasingly now. But she had spurted once and appeared to be incapable of again increasing her speed. In this way she went on for some little distance, Harry using his whip brutally, the mare desperately struggling to attain a greater pace. Riley hanging on with tenacity to her hind flanks and giving up not an inch of ground. A mile is indeed a very short distance when traversed at such a pace. The finishing flag was already but a few 100 feet farther on. Riley realized that it was time now to go to the front. He gritted his teeth together with determination and bent his head down even further toward his front wheel. Then his feet began to move so quickly that there was only visible an indistinct blur at the sides of his crankshaft. At this very second, with a face marked with rage and hatred, Harry brought his horse suddenly across the road to that part of it which he had been warned to avoid. It is hard to tell what kept Riley from being run into and trampled underfoot. An attempt at backpedaling, a sudden twist of the handlebar, a lurch to one side that almost threw him from his seat. Then, in the fraction of a second, he was over on the other side of the road, pushing ahead of the mare, almost as though she were standing still. The outburst of alarm from the throats of the soldiers changed when they saw that Riley had not been injured. First into a shout of indignation at the dastardly attempt which had been made to run him down, and then into a roar of delight when the bicyclist breasted the flag, a winner of the race by 20 feet. As he crossed the line, Riley caught a glimpse of Washington. He stood close to the flag and was waving his hat in the air with enthusiasm of a schoolboy. Riley went down the road, slackening his speed as effectively as he could. But before it was possible to entirely stop his wheel's momentum, the noisy acclamations in his rear ceased with startling suddenness. He turned in his saddle and looked back. As sure as St. Peter, he had the road entirely to himself. There wasn't a soldier or a ghost of a soldier in sight. As soon as he could, he turned his bicycle about and rode back along the highway, now so singularly deserted, looking hither and thither in vain for some trace of the vanished army. Even the flag which had been stuck into the ground at the end of the 1-mile racecourse was gone. The breeze had died out again, and the air was tranquil and warm. In the branches of a nearby tree 2 sparrows chirped and twittered peacefully. Riley went back to the place where the camp had been. He found there only open fields on one side of the road and a clump of woodland on the other. He continued on down the little hill up which Harry and his companions had brought him a few hours previously, and followed the road on further, coming finally to the fork in it near which was located the old farmhouse, wherein he had been taken captive. The house was, as it had been when he had previously entered it, falling apart from age and neglect. When he went inside, he found lying on the brick hearth in front of the fireplace a number of pieces of broken glass. End of Story 18. Story 19 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. His Dead Wife's Photograph. This story created a sensation when it was first told. It appeared in the papers, and many big physicists and natural philosophers were, at least so they thought, able to explain the phenomenon. I shall narrate the event and also tell the reader what explanation was given, and let him draw his own conclusions. This is what happened. A friend of mine, a clerk in the same office as myself, was an amateur photographer. Let's call him Jones. Jones had a half-plate, Sanders camera with a Ross lens and a Thornton Pickard behind lens shutter, with pneumatic release. The plate in question was a Ratton's Ordinary, developed with Ilford Pyro Soda Developer prepared at home. All these particulars I give for the benefit of the more technical reader. Mr. Smith, another clerk in our office, invited Mr. Jones to take the likeness of his wife and sister-in-law. This sister-in-law was the wife of Mr. Smith's elder brother, who was also a government servant, then on leave. The idea of the photograph was that of the sister-in-law. Jones was a keen photographer himself. He had photographed everybody in the office, including the peons and sweepers, and had even supplied every sitter with his copies of his handiwork. So he most willingly consented, and anxiously waited for the Sunday on which the photograph was to be taken. Early on Sunday morning, Jones went to the Smiths. The arrangement of light in the veranda was such that a photograph could only be taken after midday, so he stayed there to breakfast. About 1 p.m, all arrangements were complete, and the 2 ladies, Mrs. Smiths, were made to sit in 2 cane chairs, and after long and careful focusing, and moving the camera for about an hour, Jones was satisfied at last, and an exposure was made. Mr. Jones was sure that the plate was all right, and so a second plate was not exposed, although in the usual course of things this should have been done. He wrapped up his things and went home, promising to develop the plate the same night and bring a copy of the photograph the next day to the office. The next day, which was Monday, Jones came to the office very early, and I was the first person to meet him. "Well, Mr. Photographer," I asked, "what success?" "I got the picture all right," said Jones, unwrapping an unmounted picture and handing it over to me. "Most funny, don't you think so?" "No, I don't think it's all right. At any rate, I did not expect anything better from you," I said. "No," said Jones, "the funny thing is that the 2 ladies sat." "Quite right," I said. "The third stood in the middle." "There was no third lady at all there," said Jones. Then you imagine she was there, and there we find her." "I tell you, there were only two ladies there when I exposed," insisted Jones. He was looking awfully worried. "Do you want me to believe that there were only two persons when the plate was exposed and three when it was developed?" I asked. "That is exactly what has happened," said Jones. "Then it must be the most wonderful developer you used. Or was it that this was the second exposure given to the same plate?" "The developer is the one which I have been using for the last 3 years, and the plate, the one I charged on Saturday night out of the new box that I had purchased only on Saturday afternoon." A number of other clerks had come up in the meantime, and were taking great interest in the picture and in Jones's statement. It is only right that a description of the picture be given here for the benefit of the reader. I wish I could reproduce the original picture too, but that for certain reasons is impossible. When the plate was actually exposed there were only two ladies, both of whom were sitting in cane chairs. When the plate was developed, it was found that there was in the picture a figure, that of a lady, standing in the middle. She wore a broad-edged dhoti. The reader should not forget that all the characters are indents, only the upper half of her body being visible, the lower being covered up by the low backs of the cane chairs. She was distinctly behind the chairs, and consequently slightly out of focus. Still everything was quite clear. Even her long necklace was visible through the little opening in the dhoti near the right shoulder. She was resting her hands on the back of the chairs, and the fingers were nearly totally out of focus, but a ring on the right finger was clearly visible. She looked like a handsome young woman of 22, short and thin. One of the earrings was also clearly visible, although the face itself was slightly out of focus. One thing, and probably the funniest thing, that we overlooked then but observed afterwards, was that immediately behind the three ladies was a barred window. The two ladies, who were one on each side, covered up the bars to a certain height from the bottom with their bodies, but the lady in the middle was partly transparent because the bars of the window were very faintly visible through her. This fact, however, as I have said already, we did not observe then. We only laughed at Jones and tried to assure him that he was either drunk or asleep. At this moment Smith of our office walked in, removing the trouser clips from his legs. Smith took the unmounted photograph, looked at it for a minute, turned red and blue and green and finally very pale. Of course, we asked him what the matter was, and this was what he said. "The third lady in the middle was my first wife, who has been dead these 8 years. Before her death she asked me a number of times to have her photograph taken. She used to say that she had a presentiment that she might die early. I did not believe in her presentiment myself, but I did not object to the photograph. So one day I ordered the carriage and asked her to dress up. We intended to go to a good professional. She dressed up and the carriage was ready, but as we were going to start, news reached us that her mother was dangerously ill. So we went to see her mother instead. The mother was very ill, and I had to leave her there. Immediately afterwards I was sent away on duty to another station, and so could not bring her back. It was in fact after full 3 months and a half that I returned, and then thought her mother was all right, my wife was not. Within 15 days of my return she died of puerperal fever, after childbirth, and the child died too. A photograph of her was never taken. When she dressed up for the last time on the day that she left my home, she had the necklace and the earrings on, as you see her wearing in the photograph. My present wife has them now, but she does not generally put them on." This was too big a pill for me to swallow, so I at once took French leave from my office, bagged the photograph and rushed out on my bicycle. I went to Mr. Smith's house and looked Mrs. Smith up. Of course, she was much astonished to see a third lady in the picture, but could not guess who she was. This I had expected, as supposing Smith's story to be true, this lady had never seen her husband's first wife. The elder brother's wife, however, recognized the likeness at once, and she virtually repeated the story which Smith had told me earlier that day. She even brought out the necklace and the earrings for my inspection and conviction. They were the same as those in the photograph. All the principal newspapers of that time got hold of the fact, and within a week there was any number of applications for the ghostly photograph. But Mr. Jones refused to supply copies of it to anybody for various reasons, the principal being that Smith would not allow it. I am, however, the fortunate possessor of a copy, which, for obvious reasons, I am not allowed to show to anybody. One copy of the picture was sent to America and another to England. I do not now remember exactly to whom. My own copy I showed to the Reverend Father, M.A., D.Sc., B.D., etc., and asked him to find out a scientific explanation for the phenomenon. The following explanation was given by the gentleman. I am afraid I shall not be able to reproduce the learned Father's exact words, but this is what he meant, or at least what I understood him to mean. The girl in question was dressed in this particular way on an occasion, say 10 years ago. Her image was cast on space, and the reflection was projected from one luminous body, one planet, on another till it made a circuit of millions and millions of miles in space, and then came back to Earth at the exact moment when our friend Mr. Jones was going to make the exposure. Take for instance the case of a man who is taking a photograph of a mirage. He is photographing place X from place Y, when X and Y are, say, 200 miles apart, and it may be that his camera is facing east while placing X is actually towards the west of place Y. In school I had read a little of science and chemistry, and could make a dry analysis of a salt, but this was an item too big for my limited comprehension. The fact, however, remains, and I believe it, that Smith's first wife did come back to this terrestrial globe of ours over 8 years ago after her death to give a sitting for a photograph in a form which, though it did not affect the retina of our eye, did impress a sensitized plate, in a form that did not affect the retina of the eye, I say because Jones must have been looking at his sitters at the time when he was pressing the bulb of the pneumatic release of his time and instantaneous shutter. The story is most wonderful, but this is exactly what happened. Smith says this is the first time he has ever seen or heard from his dead wife. It's popularly believed in India that a dead wife gives a lot of trouble if she ever revisits this earth, but this is, thank God, not the experience of my friend Mr. Smith. It is now over 7 years since the event mentioned above happened, and the dead girl has never appeared again. I would very much like to have a photograph of the two ladies taken once more, but I have never ventured to approach Smith with a proposal. In fact, I learnt photography myself with a view to take the photograph of the two ladies, but as I have said, I have never been able to speak to Smith about my intention, and probably never shall. The £10 that I spent on my cheap photographic outfit may be a waste. But I have learnt an art which, though rather costly for my limited means, is nevertheless an art worth learning. End of Story 19. Story 20 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Major's Lease by S. Mukherjee. A curious little story was told the other day in a certain civil court in British India. A certain military officer, let's call him Major Brown, rented a house in one of the big cantonment stations where he had been recently transferred with his regiment. This gentleman had just arrived from England with his wife. He was the son of a rich man at home, and so he could afford to have a large house. This was the first time he had come out to India, and was consequently rather unacquainted with the manners and customs of this country. Major Brown took this house on a long lease, and thought he had made a bargain. The house was large and stood in the center of a very spacious compound. There was a garden which appeared to have been carefully laid out once, But as the house had no tenant for a long time, the garden looked more like a wilderness. There were two very well-kept lawn tennis courts, and these were a great attraction to the Major, who was very keen on tennis. The stablings and outhouses were commodious, and the Major, who was thinking of keeping a few polo ponies, found the whole thing very satisfactory. Over and above everything, he found the landlord very obliging. He had heard on board the steamer on his way out that India landlords were the worst class of human beings one could come across on the face of this earth, and that is very true. But this particular landlord looked like an exception to the general rule. He consented to make at his own expense all the alterations that the Major wanted him to do, and these alterations were carried out to Major and Mrs. Brown's entire satisfaction. On his arrival in this station, Major Brown had put up at a hotel, and after some alterations had been made, he ordered the house to be furnished. This was done in 3 or 4 days, and then he moved in. Annexed is a rough sketch of the house in question. The house was a very large one, and there was a number of rooms, but we have nothing to do with all of them. The spots marked C and E represent the doors. Now what happened in court was this. After he had occupied the house for not over 3 weeks, the Major and his wife cleared out and took shelter again in the hotel from which they had come. The landlord demanded rent for the entire period stipulated for in the lease, and the Major refused to pay. The matter went to court. The presiding judge, who was an Indian gentleman, was one of the cleverest men in the service, and he thought it was a very simple case. When the case was called on, the plaintiff's pleader said that he would begin by proving the lease. Major Brown, the defendant, who appeared in person, said that he would admit it. The judge, who was a very kind-hearted gentleman, asked the defendant why he had vacated the house. "I could not stay," said the Major. "I had every intention of living in the house. I got it furnished and spent 2,000 rupees over it. I was laying out a garden. But what do you mean by saying that you could not stay? If your honor passed a night in that house, you would understand what I meant," said the Major. "You take the oath and make a statement," said the judge. Major Brown then made the following statement on oath in open court. "When I came to the station, I saw the house and my wife liked it. We asked the landlord whether he would make a few alterations, and he consented. After the alterations had been carried out, I executed the lease and ordered the house to be furnished. A week after the execution of the lease, we moved in. The house is very large." Here followed a description of the building, but to make matters clear and short, I have copied out a rough pencil sketch which is still on the record of the case and marked the doors and rooms, as the Major had done, with letters. I do not dine at the mess. I have an early dinner at home with my wife and retire early. My wife and I sleep in the same bedroom, the room marked G on the plan, and we are generally in bed about 11 o'clock at night. The servants all go away to the outhouses, which are at a distance of about 40 yards from the main building. Only one jamadar porter remains in the front veranda. This jamadar also keeps an eye on the whole main building. Besides, I have got a good, faithful watchdog which I brought out from home. He stays outside with the jamadar. For the first 15 days we were quite comfortable. Then the trouble began. One night before dinner my wife was reading a story, a detective story, of a particularly interesting nature. There were only a few more pages left, and so we thought she would finish them before we put out the reading lamp. We were in the bedroom, but it took her much longer than she had expected it would, and so it was actually a half an hour after midnight when we put out our 16-candle power reading lamp, which stood on a teapoy near the head of the beds. Only a small bedroom lamp remained. But though we put out the light, we did not fall asleep. We were discussing the cleverness of the detective and the folly of the thief who had left a clue behind, and it was actually 2 o'clock when we pulled our rugs up to our necks and closed our eyes. At that moment we heard footsteps of a number of persons walking along the corridor. The corridor runs the whole length of the house, as will appear from the rough sketch. This corridor was well carpeted, still we heard the tread of a number of feet. We looked at the door C. This door was closed but not bolted from inside. Slowly it was pushed open, and horror of horrors, 3 shadowy forms walked into the room. One was distinctly the form of a white man in European night attire, another the form of a white woman, also in night attire, and the third was the form of a black woman, probably an Indian nurse or ayah. We remained dumb with horror, as we could see clearly that these unwelcome visitors were not of this world. We could not move. The 3 figures passed right around the beds, as if searching for something. They looked into every nook and corner of the bedroom, and then passed into the dressing room. Within half a minute they returned, and passed out into the corridor in the same order in which they had come in, namely, the man first, the white woman next, and the black woman last of all. We lay as if dead. We could hear them in the corridor and in the bedroom adjoining, with the door E, and in the dressing room attached to that bedroom. They again returned and passed into the corridor, and then we could hear them no more. It must have taken me at least 5 minutes to collect my senses and to bring my limbs under control. When I got up I found that my wife had fainted. I hurried out of the room, rushed along the corridor, opened the front door and called the servants. The servants were all approaching the house across the land which separated the servants' quarters from the main building. Then I went into the dining room, and procuring some brandy, gave it to my wife. It was with some difficulty that I could make her swallow it, but it revived her, and she looked at me with a bewildered smile on her face. The servants had in the meantime arrived and were in the corridor. Their presence had the effect of giving us some courage. Leaving my wife in bed, I went out and related to the servants what I had seen. The chowkidar, the night watchman, was an old resident of the compound. In fact, he had been in charge of the house when it was vacant, before I rented it. Gave me the history of the ghost, which my jamadar interpreted to me. I have brought the chowkidar and shall produce him as my witness. This was the statement of the major. Then there was the statement of Jokai Pasi, chowkidar, defendant's witness. The statement of this witness as recorded was as follows. My age is 60 years. At the time of the Indian Mutiny, I was a full-grown young man. This house was built at that time. I mean 2 or 3 years after the Mutiny. I have always been in charge. After the Mutiny, one judge came to live in the house. He was called Judge Parson, probably Pearson. The judge had to try a young Mohammedan charged with murder, and he sentenced the youth to death. The aged parents of the young man vowed vengeance against the good judge. On the night following the morning on which the execution took place, it appeared that certain undesirable characters were prowling about the compound. I was then the watchman in charge as I am now. I woke up the Indian nurse who slept with the judge's baby in a bedroom adjoining the one in which the judge himself slept. On waking up she found that the baby was not in its cot. She rushed out of the bedroom and informed the judge and his wife. Then a feverish search began for the baby, but it was never found. The police were communicated with and they arrived at about 4 a.m. The police inquiry lasted for about half an hour, and then the officers went away promising to come again. At last the judge, his wife, and nurse all retired to their respective beds, where they were found lying dead later in the morning. Another police inquiry took place, and it was found that the death was due to snakebite. There were 2 small punctures on one leg of each victim. How a snake got in and killed each victim in turn, especially when 2 slept in one room and a third in another, finally got out, has remained a mystery. But the judge, his wife, and the nurse are still seen on every Friday night looking for the missing baby. One rainy season the servants' quarters were being re-roofed. I had then an occasion to sleep in the corridor, and thus I saw the ghosts. At that time I was afraid as the Major Sahib is today, but then I soon found out that the ghosts were quite harmless." This was the story as recorded in court. The judge was a very sensible man. I had the pleasure and honor of being introduced to him about 20 years after this incident, and with a number of people, he decided to pass one Friday night in the haunted house. He did so. What he saw does not appear from the record, for he left no inspection notes and probably he never made any. He delivered judgment on Monday following. It is a very short judgment. After reciting the facts, the judgment proceeds. I have recorded the statements of the defendant and a witness produced by him. I have also made a local inspection. I find that the landlord, the plaintiff, knew that for certain reasons the house was practically uninhabitable, and he concealed that fact from his tenant. He therefore could not recover. The suit is dismissed with costs. The haunted house remained untenanted for a long time. The proprietor subsequently made a gift of it to a charitable institution. The founders of this institution, who were Hindus and firm believers in charms and exorcisms, had some religious ceremony performed on the premises. Afterwards the house was pulled down, and on its site now stands one of the grandest buildings in the station, that cost fully £10,000. Only this morning I received a visit from a gentleman who lives in the building, referred to above, but evidently he has not even heard of the ghosts of the judge, his wife, and his Indian ayah. It is now nearly 50 years, but the missing baby has not been heard of. If it is alive, it has grown into a fully developed man. But does he know the fate of his parents and his nurse? In this connection it will not be out of place to mention a fact that appeared in the papers some years ago. A certain European gentleman was posted to a district in the Madras Presidency as a government servant in the financial department. When this gentleman reached the station to which he had been posted, he put up at the club, as they usually do, and began to look out for a house, when he was informed that there was a haunted house in the neighborhood. Being rather skeptical, he decided to take this house, ghost or no ghost. He was given to understand by the members of the club that this house was a bit out of the way, and was infested at night with thieves and robbers, who came to divide their booty in that house, and to guard against its being occupied by a tenant it had been given a bad reputation. The proprietor, being a wealthy old native of the old school, did not care to investigate. So our friend, whom we shall, for the purpose of this story, call Mr. Hunter, took the house at a fair rent. The house was in charge of a chowdakar, caretaker, porter, or watchman, when it was vacant. Mr. Hunter engaged the same man as night watchman for this house. This chowdakar informed Mr. Hunter that the ghost appeared only one day in the year, namely the 21st of September, and added that if Mr. Hunter kept out of the house on that night, there would be no trouble. "I always keep away on the night of the 21st September, said the watchman. "And what kind of ghost is it?" asked Mr. Hunter. "It is a European lady dressed in white," said the man. "What does she do?" asked Mr. Hunter. "Oh, she comes out of the room and calls you and asks you to follow her," said the man. "Has anybody ever followed her?" "Nobody that I know of, sir," said the man. "The man who was here before me saw her and died from fear." "Most wonderful! But why do not people follow her in a body?" asked Mr. Hunter. "It is very easy to say that, sir, but when you see her, you will not like to follow her yourself. I have been in this house for over 20 years. Lots of times European soldiers have passed the night of the 21st September, intending to follow her, but when she actually comes, nobody has ever ventured." "Most wonderful! I shall follow her this time," said Mr. Hunter. "As you please, sir," said the man, and retired. It was one of the duties of Mr. Hunter to distribute the pensions of all retired government servants. In this connection Mr. Hunter used to come in contact with a number of very old men in the station who attended his office to receive their pensions from him. By questioning them, Mr. Hunter got so far that the house had once been occupied by a European officer. This officer had a young wife who fell in love with a certain Captain Leslie. One night when the husband was out on tour, and not expected to return within a week, his wife was entertaining Captain Leslie. The gentleman returned unexpectedly and found his wife in the arms of the captain. He lost his self-control and attacked the couple with a meat chopper, the first weapon that came handy. Captain Leslie moved away and then cleared out, leaving the unfortunate wife at the mercy of the infuriated husband. He aimed a blow at her head, which she warded off with her hand, but so severe was the blow that the hand was cut off, and the woman fell down on the ground quite unconscious. The sight of blood made the husband mad. Subsequently, the servants came up and called a doctor, but by the time the doctor arrived, the woman was dead. The unfortunate husband, who had become raving mad, was sent to a lunatic asylum and thence taken away to England. The body of the woman was in the local cemetery, but what had become of the severed hand was not known. The missing limb was never found. All this was 50 years ago, that is, immediately after the Indian Mutiny. This was what Mr. Hunter gathered. The 21st September was not very far off. Mr. Hunter decided to meet the ghost. The night in question arrived, and Mr. Hunter sat in his bedroom with his magazine. The lamp was burning brightly. The servants had all retired, and Mr. Hunter knew that if he called for help, nobody would hear him, and even if anybody did hear, he too would not come. He was, however, a very bold man, and sat there awaiting developments. At 1 a.m. he heard footsteps approaching the bedroom from the direction of the dining room. He could distinctly hear the rustle of the skirts. Gradually the door between the two rooms began to open wide. The curtains began to move. Mr. Hunter sat with straining eyes and beating heart. At last she came in, the English woman in flowing white robes. Mr. Hunter sat panting, unable to move. She looked at him for about a minute and beckoned him to follow her. It was then that Mr. Hunter observed that she had only one hand. He got up and followed her. She went back to the dining room and he followed her there. There was no light in the dining room, but he could see her faintly in the dark. She went right across the dining room to the door on the other side, which opened on the veranda. Mr. Hunter could not see what she was doing at the door, but he knew she was opening it. When the door was open, she passed out and Mr. Hunter followed. Then she walked across the veranda, down the steps, and stood upon the lawn. Mr. Hunter was on the lawn in a moment. His fears now completely vanished. She next proceeded along the lawn in the direction of a hedge. Mr. Hunter also reached the hedge and found that under the hedge were concealed 2 spades. The gardener must have been working with them and left them there after the day's work. The lady made a sign to him and he took up one of the spades. Then again she proceeded and he followed. They had reached some distance in the garden when the lady with her foot indicated a spot, and Mr. Hunter inferred that she wanted him to dig there. Of course, Mr. Hunter knew that he was not going to discover a treasure trove, but he was sure he was going to find something very interesting. So he began digging with all his vigor. Only about 18 inches below the surface, the blade struck against some hard substance. Mr. Hunter looked up. The apparition had vanished. Mr. Hunter dug on and discovered that the hard substance was a human hand with the fingers and everything intact. Of course the flesh had gone, only the bones remained. Mr. Hunter picked up the bones and knew exactly what to do. He returned to the house, dressed himself up in his cycling costume, and rode away with the bones and the spade to the cemetery. He waked the night watchman, got the gate opened, found out the tomb of the murdered woman, and close to it interred the bones that he had found in such a mysterious fashion, reciting as much of the service as he could remember. Then he paid some bukshish reward to the night watchman and came home. He put back the spade in its old place and retired. A few days after he paid a visit to the cemetery in the daytime and found that grass had grown on the spot which he had dug up. The bones had evidently not been disturbed. The next year, on the 21st December, Mr. Hunter kept up the whole night, but he had no visit from the ghostly lady. The house is now in the occupation of another European gentleman who took it after Mr. Hunter's transfer from the station, and this new tenant had no visit from the ghost either. Let us hope that she now rests in peace. The following extract from a Bengal newspaper that appeared in September 1913 is very interesting and instructive. The following extraordinary phenomenon took place at the Hooghly Police Club building, Chinchora, at about midnight on last Saturday. At this late hour of the night, some peculiar sounds of agony on the roof of the house aroused the resident members of the club, who at once proceeded to the roof with lamps and found to their entire surprise a lady clad in white jumping from the roof to the ground, about 100 feet in height, followed by a man with a dagger in his hands. But eventually no trace of it could be found on the ground. This is not the first occasion that such beings are found to visit this house, and it is heard from a reliable source that long ago a woman committed suicide by hanging, and it is believed that her spirit loiters around the building. As these incidents have made a deep impression upon the members, they have decided to remove the club from the said buildings. End of Story 20.